My name is Simon Tate from the University of Sheffield in the UK. Um, so I thought, talked with Peter van Rolga, and we thought it might be interesting for someone to give you a perspective on Brexit, the sort of UK leaving the EU after nearly 50 years. And the sort of talk, or I would like to sort of explore, or the area I'd like to explore, is the concept of the UK returning to become the dirty old man of Europe, which we were in the 60s and 70s, and maybe give you a view on transnational environmental regulation and how it's had an impact on the UK over the last 45 years. I think one of the interesting things when you look back historically is that the point in time when the UK joined the EU was quite an interesting one in terms of environmental protection. So if you look back in the literatures, you can see in the 70s and 80s that there was a growing awareness of the transnational aspects of environmental pollution, particularly in the scientific arena, where subjects such as environmental sciences, environmental chemistry, were starting to become developed and mainstreamed. And probably in Europe, the first sort of major environmental pollution instance was the studies on acid rain, which started to emerge in the 70s. So basically you had sort of coal power power stations in Western Europe, or the fringes of Western Europe, so in the UK and France, and their emissions were starting to damage the forests in Central Europe. So you can see the picture at the top there. That was a forest in central Germany, damaged by this environmental pollution. The picture below is a power station called Drax, which is about 40 miles from where I live. It was the biggest power station in the UK. It supplied just under 10% of the UK's power needs, and it's going to close in 2021. So even though the plant's still operational, it will close in 2021, mainly because of EU-derived legislation in terms of carbon credits. When you look at the 70s and 80s, there was certainly the growth in transnational environmental NGOs. So you can trace back a lot of NGOs' origins to groups in the 70s and 80s. And probably the first sort of transnational environmental protection legislation was one on transboundary air pollution that was signed in 1979. So it was 32 countries, all the countries in the EU, the US and Canada. But this agreement was a model for effective international environmental protection cooperation, because it brought together scientists and policymakers, and for the first time, policymakers started to follow scientific knowledge and information to try and solve some complex transboundary problems. And the picture at the bottom is a picture taken in the UK in this time, where we still dump sewage sludge into the North Sea. I want to give you a sort of small history lesson about the UK, just to try and give you some context as to how environmental protection developed. So we start to look at the UK in the 70s and 80s, so you have to be my sort of age in the 50s to appreciate this. The 1960s, water management in the UK was very fragmented. We'd all sorts of local authorities having some responsibility in terms of water supply or drainage, and they could range from very, very small authorities to authorities looking after maybe hundreds of thousands of people. And in the 60s, we suffered some severe droughts and floods, and this drove some change. There was a Water Act in 1973, and it established 10 new regional water authorities. Now, these didn't have direct elections, but had national government and local authority appointees, but they were politically controlled bodies. Now, these authorities issued discharge permits, they checked river quality monitoring, but they also ran the water supply, the water treatment works and the wastewater treatment plants, and supplied water and wastewater services. So you had an organisation that both supplied water services that damaged the environment, but also did the compliance checking as well. The finance for these organisations was supposed to be on a cost recovery basis. In the UK, the 70s and 80s were dominated by lots of economic instability. So you can see on the left-hand side, with the fuel crisis in 1974 with no fuel. We also had periods of industrial action. You had a 3-day week in the UK for some years. So all this economic instability meant that there was insufficient investment, especially for environmental protection, because these regional water authorities, because of the political control of them, obviously politicians wanted to spend their money on schools and hospitals rather than wastewater treatment plants and water treatment plants. The photograph at the bottom, the big sort of political event in the 70s, was Edward Heath signed the accession document and we entered the EU. But if you look at the decade, by 1982, capital expenditure in the regional water authorities had fallen by 50% compared to the 1974 levels. So the regional water authorities were starting to fail. It was realised that they just weren't able to persuade either local or central government to provide them with the expenditure to even just maintain their assets, let alone improve them. We move into the 1980s. Three photographs on the left-hand side are quite important. So you have Margaret Thatcher at the top, who I'm sure, well, certainly people of my age would recognise. People might not recognise the person below that. And that person was Sir Keith Joseph, who was Margaret Thatcher's economic advisor. And he was a strong right-wing monetarist who was very interested in the value of money and also interested in reducing the size of government. And one of the programs he delivered was a privatization program. So in the 80s, as we moved into the 90s, the government in the UK privatized as many organizations as possible. So there were some commercial ones like British Steel, but also all the utilities were privatized as well. So the picture at the bottom is the privatization, the first one of a utility, which was British Telecom, but the regional water authorities were also privatized. And basically in 1990, we went from 10 large regional water authorities to 10 large water companies in England and Wales. Now, the reason behind this was it was recognised there was a requirement to fund improved assets and improved services, but the government at the time wasn't willing to use taxpayers' money for it. And they weren't willing to increase government borrowing to allow the regional water authorities to make the improvements. So water companies are private companies. They hold a 25-year license. They are funded, or they derive their income from customer charges and borrowing on the private equity markets. So the important thing for people like Keith Joseph and Margaret Thatcher was that there was no more government borrowing involved. All these companies are monopolies, although they're supposed to be in competition with each other and are heavily regulated. So there's three main regulators in the UK for the water sector. The Drinking Water Inspectorate is the smallest and looks at basically the quality of drinking water supplied to people's properties. Ofwat is the largest regulator and looks at the economics of the water sector in the UK, and that's the most important one. The Environment Agency is a separate regulator and looks at the protection or is responsible for the protection of the environment. One of the things that was developed in the 1990s was that water companies had a 5-year planning and investment cycle, and this was regulated by Ofwat, which was the Water Service Regulation Authority. So just to give you an idea of the structure in the UK, so every 5 years, Ofwat sets the limits that water companies can charge in a process known as the price review process. They have to take into consideration that the investors in these companies should get a reasonable return, and that's their main consideration. The price setting is informed by the Environment Agency's National Environmental Programme. So the price reviews lead to a 5-year program of investment and operational costs, which agrees investment for environmental protection. So once these plans are agreed with companies, they have a 5-year environmental protection investment program. At the moment, we've just gone from PR19, which is price review 2019. We've gone into AMP6, which is a 6 asset management period, which lasts from 2020 to 2025. There's less bias in this program to capital projects, a much more consideration of the total cost of solutions and responses. There's a use of what's known as operational delivery incentives, and a lot of these are linked to environmental improvements. So operational delivery incentives are economic targets that water companies have to address or meet. And basically, if they meet the target, they get rewarded. If they fail the target, they get heavily penalized. So these ODIs really do drive behavior in water companies. Coming back to Europe, Edward Heath got us in 1974. So again, as we go into the 80s, again, two politicians, Margaret Thatcher and Jacques Delors, at the opposite end of the political spectrum, but in Europe, they were strong allies. Margaret Thatcher wanted European regulations to open up the economies and allow British finance firms and other firms to operate in Europe. Jacques Delors wanted European regulation to equalize social and environmental regulations. So in Europe, environmental regulations in the member countries are determined within a framework described by directives. So national governments take the directives and then transcribe these directives into national legislation and regulation. So the key ones for us in the water sector are the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, the Bathing Water Directive, Habitats Directive, Flooding Directive, and Water Framework Directive. What this directive and national regulation structure can mean is that although the directive is the same throughout Europe, the national regulations can vary widely, both in terms of their scope and detail. Very brief on this slide, I just want to show you the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive text and the Water Framework Directive text. And this is how directives have modified themselves and adapted with time. The Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive was one in the early 90s. It was very quantitative. So it said that we had to have adequate collection systems for populations over 2,000. It said states had to have adequate measures to limit pollution to receiving waters. Whereas if you go to the Water Framework Directive, it gives much more broader targets. It says that the quality or the ecological status of receiving surface waters shouldn't deteriorate and in fact should improve. It says that we should promote sustainable water use, and it has the aim to enhance protection. So the Water Framework Directive has its purposes at a much higher level, much less quantitative, and it gives national governments much greater flexibility. So consequences for the UK for, let's say, the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive was that for the first 10 years of the privatised water companies, we spent over £9 billion basically refurbishing wastewater treatment plants in order to get effluent discharge standards, qualities to a reasonable standard. From the year 2000, there's now been a significant focus on intermittent discharges. We've probably spent round about the same amount of money again in the next 10 years. And remember, all this money is not being obtained from the government, but from private borrowing. Discharge consents can only be given with evidence now. And in the period from the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, we've lots of new modelling codes of practice, new modelling tools. If you look at software such as InfoWorks, much of its development was done in the 90s. We have regulations on aesthetic solids that you won't find anywhere else in Europe, but we've put them into national regulations. The Urban Pollution Manual was another piece of research that led to concentration duration standards for UK rivers. We also have monitoring of all our CSOs and better reporting mechanisms. So all these new regulations came to were applied to the UK because of the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive. And it has made big improvements. So by 2009, sort of 20 years after the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive was approved, 80% of the rivers in England were of a good chemical quality, and that's an increase of almost 25% since 1990. The right-hand side gives you the sort of regulations in their detail. One of the interesting things that we have in the UK is ministers can direct water companies to do things, and in 2013 we had a government minister who stood up and told water companies that basic monitoring of your CSO was sound management and that you should do it by 2020. So that's driven a huge program of CSO monitoring in the UK. So probably by the end of this year, we'll probably be monitoring 15,000 CSOs. If you look at the popular UK view of EU directives, they're seen as highly complex, but the UK is quite a highly centralised country, so the complexity could come from our central government developing very, very complex regulations from European directives. If I compare the UK directives on intermittent discharges from CSOs compared to the regulations in Belgium, Belgium has one design storm, and you have to design your CSO storage for that one design storm. In the UK, we have to look at a number of different return periods and durations and look at the concentration and duration of the various pollutants into rivers, then consider the impact, concentration, duration of that pollutant in the river in order to make a full assessment. So it's much more complex in the UK than it is in Belgium. So there is an additional cost burden. We always have the view that others don't follow the rules. Well, they certainly don't follow the UK rules, but they probably do follow the directives. Infractions of the directives were always made to be unpopular. This might be a sort of British or maybe English exceptionalism, but in the end, the UK government always complied with them. And to give you an example of that, the probably biggest infraction in the UK was that we never had an adequate sewer collection system in London. We always had too many CSO spills. That's now been solved by a large storage tunnel, and that large storage tunnel is costing us just under £5 billion. So we lost the court case at Europe, the infraction was proved, and in the end we paid up and provided a solution. So what's the future for the UK? And I see this as the danger of divergence. This is another interesting character, Michael Gove. He's the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. So if you can work out what that role is, you're better than me. But basically, he's the government's chief fixer. He was the Secretary of State for Environment. And after the Brexit referendum in 2016, he said that the UK would actually enforce stricter environmental regulations. And that was one of the reasons why he wanted to leave the EU, because he wanted stricter environmental protection than there was in the EU itself. But although we have to take Michael Gove at his word, the other sort of concept this drives is divergence. And divergence from Europe was very, very important to the people who wanted Brexit. So let's maybe give you some final thoughts about the EU leaving Europe and how that might impact on the protection of water bodies in the UK. If you haven't lived in the UK, you won't appreciate that the Brexit process has been a very, very debilitating one for the country. In the UK, we are used to having majority governments who determine what the legislation is, and the country runs in a very predictable and smooth way. We've had 3 years of a minority government, with the government being defeated in Parliament, policies changing, and great uncertainty. Now, in some countries that may be the norm, but in the UK it's not. Many of the civil servants who develop and implement environmental protection policies have been seconded to other departments, more urgent policy areas. The person in charge of the intermittent discharges policies from sewer systems was seconded for 6 months to the Brexit department. He's now back, thankfully, but the Environment Department had significant weaknesses over the last 3 years. We also probably lack the capability to independently develop policy. All our civil servants over the last 40, 45 years have experience of implementing policy that has been developed at a European level. They've been very good and diligent at it, and we've got some really great and consistent regulations, but they've never ever really had to take the science and to take high-level science to develop high-level policy. So that's a concern. The water companies in the UK are well resourced and really have quite a comfortable life. In the asset management plan cycle, their investment plans are fixed for 5 years. Their income is relatively fixed for 5 years. They have reasonably good relationships with both Ofwat and the Environment Agency, and the planning process is coherent and well understood. So that level of economic uncertainty means that investment for environmental protection is quite secure. There's also generally quite strong grassroots supports for environmental protection. Obviously, new open data initiatives enhances visibility. The picture at the top there is a local river close to where I live. It's very, very popular with people that swim in the river. Unfortunately, this location here is about 1 kilometre downstream from a large CSO. The CSO monitoring data makes that visible now, and the water company is under severe pressure to have this stretch of water go from receiving surface water to bathing water. And if it's classified as a bathing water, then the protection measures at the CSO will have to be significantly enhanced. So although I think the Brexit process, we won't have poorer environmental protection, the two concerns that I do have is there is a strong political will to demonstrate divergence. We've left Europe, it's cost us a lot, it's been very debilitating, it may have a high economic cost, but the government wants to show that we can diverge and that we are different. There's no indication that environmental standards is going to be one of those areas, but there's no indication that it's not. One issue that may drive some divergence is that the agriculture sector is likely to be highly impacted by Brexit. If you look at the tariff rates that we're proposing, agriculture is one sector in the country that's going to be protected. So in the UK, we have effectively solved point source pollution. So we've dealt with effluent from treatment works, or CSOs have had a huge amount of investment in them. The next challenge for water pollution in the UK is diffuse pollution, and that needs to link with the agricultural sector. So there may be significant resistance to better environmental protection standards if they have an impact on the agricultural sector. So in the UK, it's a time of uncertainty, but there's lots in our system that indicate that we will continue as usual, particularly in terms of the water sector and environmental protection. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm quite happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was really, really interesting. Actually, I was surprised to learn that all the water plants are privately owned in the UK. I didn't know that, because maybe you might know about this, but in Quebec, it's mainly owned by municipalities or managed by municipalities. We have some private companies, but normally it's municipalities who manage our water. So we already have 2 questions. I don't know if you can bring up your chat box so you can see them.
Let's see.
I think if you stop your screen sharing, it's going to be easier. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And then maybe I can, if you could read the question out loud before answering it.
Okay.
Thanks.
I'll go for Alexandra first. In the recent past, I've studied legislation pertaining to wastewater treatment in remote residences, which are not served by a municipal collection system. What is the extent of remote residents testing their own water in the UK, and how advanced is the legislation regarding to it? So certainly in terms of wastewater, if I look at my local water company, which is Yorkshire Water, they have round about 400 wastewater treatment plants. Probably 10% of those are extremely large ones. One of the nearest ones to me serves approximately a 1 million population equivalent, but they'll go down to treatment plants that will serve maybe 50 population equivalent. So one of the challenges Yorkshire Water has had over the last 20 years is they have reduced their operational staff. So they're looking at plants where they can put a lot of automation in and monitoring. The big plants, that's straightforward. It's easy to justify that additional capital investment. At smaller treatment plants, it's not so easy. So they have had a challenge looking for low-cost monitoring technologies. The Environment Agency still requires effluent discharge quality tests, either on a weekly or a monthly basis, depending on the size, the volume of the effluent discharge, and importantly, the sensitivity of the receiving water. So if you've got a small plant into a very small receiving water with a phosphorus problem in the catchment, you may get sampled every week. And that might only be for a treatment plant with 50 or 100 population equivalent. In terms of remote residences treating their own water, it is unusual. It's unusual for residences to have their private own water supply. It's a bit more common in Scotland than in England and Wales. Even with a private water supply, it's still subject to testing by the Drinking Water Inspectorate. So the Drinking Water Inspectorate regulates the quality of drinking water in the UK. Water companies have an obligation to provide drinking water that meets the standards of the Drinking Water Inspectorate. So normally what would happen if a private water supply failed, they would normally provide a tankered service to meet the standards of the Drinking Water Quality Inspectorate. Oh, wastewater as well. The Environment Agency are very reluctant to provide discharge consent for septic tanks. So they look for small packet treatment plants rather than a sort of old style traditional septic tank. So they'll only provide a discharge consent from a sort of more packet sort of small treatment plant, which obviously would be emptied once a year. So the regulations on small individual residences are quite strict as well. Yeah, this is legislated. So it's regulated by the Environment Agency, which is one of the 3 regulators, and they regulate effectively all discharges to the environment. No, there are no incentives. It's a requirement for them to meet.
Can you read the question? Can you read the question?
Oh, sorry. The questions are there incentive for privately owned wastewater treatment facilities to follow a certain set of environmental regulations, given a situation where no government regulations are in place? So for the small privately owned wastewater treatment facilities, there is no economic support for their provision and operation, but the regulations come from the Environment Agency and they are applied, if that makes sense. So if you want to live in a remote residence, then you have to provide your own wastewater services and meet the discharge regulations.
There's also a question from Peter, if you go.
Yes, I thought I'd leave that one to the... Sorry, so there's a question from Peter. So as a Scotsman, I'm sure you can talk a bit about the Scottish situation and to what extent they will be able to continue following EAU directives or approaches. Would you agree that the Water Framework Directive was to a large extent inspired by the way UK conducted river basin management? So it's two questions. The situation in Scotland did follow to some extent what happened in the 70s and 80s in England. There was a recognition, again in Scotland, that there was too many small municipalities with water and wastewater responsibilities, and they were combined into a single company in Scotland called Scottish Water. Now, it's a strange company in the sense that it is a private company, but the only shareholder is the Scottish government. So it's set up as a private company, so it can borrow money on the private money markets. It gets its income, again, from customer charges, but the customer charges are collected through taxation rather than direct billing. And their owner is the Scottish government rather than individuals. So they tend to have a slightly longer term, different approach to things. They tend to look over a 25-year period. They still have a 5-year asset management period, but it's a period that's agreed with the Scottish version of Ofwat, which is a branch of the Scottish government, rather than Ofwat, which regulates companies in England and Wales. So the Scottish regulator doesn't have the requirement to ensure that investors get a reasonable return for their money. So it's still a private company, but it's owned by the Scottish government. So it's halfway between public and private. In Wales, there's one company, De Cymru. Again, it's set up as a private company, but it is owned by a charity set up by the Welsh government. So again, it's almost a sort of publicly owned organisation, but has the organisational and economic structure of a private company. In terms of Peter's second question about the Water Framework Directive was to a large extent inspired by the way UK conducted river basin management. I would agree with that, because certainly you had the earlier Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, and we were very concerned about wastewater effluent discharges and intermittent discharges, and there was a lot of research in the UK in the 80s and the 90s on ways to quantify impact from wastewater and wastewater plants and CSOs on natural water courses. So a lot of studies, a lot of ecological studies, and the Urban Pollution Manual drew in a lot of those ecological studies so that we were trying to estimate the true environmental impact on a natural river system. So one of the examples of the Urban Pollution Management Manual is for our CSO assessment, you have different standards for different types of fish for different return periods and different durations of storm with different constant contaminant duration thresholds. So it really was quite a sophisticated impact-based assessment system, and that came from the UK. And I think that inspired the concept in the Water Framework Directive that you should look at ecological impact rather than just following fixed numbers of either spill frequencies or concentration of pollutants. Because if you look at quite a few European countries, and maybe we'll go to Belgium for this time, Belgium, to look at its Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive type impacts, just looked at the frequency of spills from a CSO. Didn't matter if it was into a big or a large river. So it was looking at the performance of the CSO rather than the impact on the environment.